project is a book called Exemplars Virtue Theory, which will be the topic of my Gifford lectures in the fall. And an important component of the theory is exemplars of wisdom. I need advice in applying this, my methodology that I'm going to describe to you, to this class of exemplars. Slide 2. Now the slide should say Exemplars Virtue Theory on top, I hope. Is that right? Is that right? Is it there?
Yep, we're there.
Okay. So to summarize my theory in one sentence, exemplarist virtue theory is a moral theory I'm developing in which all the basic moral terms, good person, right act, virtue, good life, etc., are defined by direct reference to exemplars of goodness, picked out through the emotion of admiration. And I have philosophical aims in devising this theory to map moral terms around the class of exemplars, also practical aims to motivate us to become good persons by generating the theory around admiration, which I see as a motivating emotion. And I hope you will also see that there's a third aim, which is to link the a priori side of ethics with empirical studies. Next slide, slide 3. Now, my model is the theory of direct reference, which revolutionized semantics and philosophy of mind in the 70s, and I think many of you are aware of that. But to see what was really revolutionary about this theory, I want to contrast it with the dominant theory of reference at the time, which was the traditional descriptive theory of reference. And according to this theory, the meaning of a term is a description in the head. And what we refer to when we're using a term is whatever satisfies the description. So take, for example, the term hammer. If you know the meaning of hammer, according to this theory, you carry around with you a description of a hammer in your head. Something like heavy tool with a head at right angles to the handle used to drive in nails or something like that. And then whenever you talk about hammers, you're talking about whatever satisfies that description. Well, Kripke and Putnam and others thought that this was wrong, that there are terms, particularly natural kind terms, which do not refer through a description. They thought that a natural kind term like water or gold refers to whatever is the same kind of thing or stuff as some indexically identified instance. So, for example, gold is whatever is the same element as that. Water is whatever is the same liquid as that. A cat is whatever is a member of the same species as that, and so on. So the idea is you can succeed in referring without going through a description in your head. If you have a description in your head, it can be vague, it might even be wrong, but that does not prevent you from being semantically successful. So next slide, slide 4. So the idea here is that if a natural kind is that, we can identify superficial features of the kind to fix the reference of the kind term. And this allows us to find more instances of it. So in the case of water, the superficial features would be something like colorless, tasteless liquid that flows in the streams and that falls from the sky. But we don't think of these features as necessary or sufficient for being an instance of the kind. We just use them to find instances of the kind for investigation. So we find out what makes a kind what it is by empirical investigation of the stuff that we pick out through the superficial features. And so, of course, we find out water is H2O. So what's important about the theory here is that being H2O is what makes water water, not the superficial features. But being H2O explains its superficial features. So this theory smoothly connects semantics with science. Semantics tells us what to investigate, and science does the investigating. Next slide. So an interesting consequence is that empirical investigation can reveal natures. It tells us what we are talking about. Empirical investigation actually tells us what we're talking about. When we're talking about water, we're talking about H2O. When we're talking about cats, we're talking about animals that have a certain biological structure. And this leads to what became known as semantic externalism, that the contents of our thoughts and our speech when we talk about water or cats is determined outside of our head. We're not talking about something that fits a description in our head, but rather we're talking about something we discover when we investigate stuff like that. So it follows that the traditional descriptivist theory of meaning is false. Okay, next slide. So I am using this theory as my model for generating moral theory, which I call exemplars moral theory or exemplars virtue theory. And I propose that good persons are persons like that. And then we point to Confucius or Jesus or St. Francis or Stoic sages, Greek heroes, and so on. So these persons are picked out through the emotion of admiration. And the theory says that we can refer to good persons without a description in our head, without a description of what good persons are, that gives necessary and sufficient conditions for being a good person. We find out what makes good persons good or what makes exemplars good by close observation. The observation can take the form of narratives or it could take the form of empirical studies. So this is parallel to finding out what makes water water by empirical investigation. Next slide. So this leads to moral semantic externalism, parallel to the semantic externalism of direct reference. So for natural kinds, we think that the deep physical structure is what we mean to be referring to when we use a term like water, and the deep physical structure explains the superficial properties that we use to fix the reference of the term, like water. Similarly, I'm suggesting that when we say good person, the deep psychological structure of that person is what we mean to be referring to when we say good person, and that this psychological structure explains the easily observable properties that we use to fix the reference of good person. And we discover these deep properties of exemplars through observation. Next slide, slide 8. Now, in the theory I'm working on, I have three kinds or three categories of exemplars: heroes, saints, and sages. For heroes, the target class is easy. It's pretty obvious. Heroes perform easily observable heroic acts. And once we can identify people who perform these heroic acts, we can study them to find out the deep components of heroism or courage. And I talk in particular about Holocaust rescuers because there already are some interesting studies, narratives, interviews, and other empirical studies of Holocaust rescuers. The same point applies to saints. I think the target class is fairly obvious. What we call saints are people who perform easily observed saintly acts. And once we find the class of saints that we want to study, we can then investigate them. Once we have the right class, we can then investigate them. And there have been investigations of large caregivers that I use in the book because these investigations include investigations of a lot of different kinds. There's interviews and narratives, and some large caregivers have even been put in the laboratory and play various laboratory games. Okay, so that's fine for heroes and saints, but my problem is the class of sages or wise persons. Because for sages, the target class is not at all obvious. There don't seem to be easily observable wise acts that we can use to identify the right class. I mean, there might be people who utter wise words, that's okay, but we know we can find some exemplars of wisdom, but the problem is we want to find more of them. We want to find a class of wise people that we can then study. Next slide, slide 9. This should be the one that's it should have a lot of boxes, discovering essential properties empirically. So this summarizes what I've been saying. This is my problem. On the left, I have a list of kind terms. The first two are natural kinds, water and cat, and then three kinds of exemplars, three terms for exemplars: hero, saint, and sage. And then in the middle column, we have superficial properties that I think fix the reference of the relevant kind. So these are properties that are not constitutive of being the kind. They're not essential to the kind, but they're properties that we can use to identify the kind for further study. And then in the third column, I have deep properties that are essential to the kind. That is, the properties that we're really interested in if we want to find out what the kind is. And the properties in the third column should not only be deep properties, the ones we're most interested in, but they should be properties that explain the presence of the superficial properties. So that works fine for water and cat, and I think it works pretty well for hero and saint. So, for example, hero, we think that the motivational structure of heroic persons, courageous persons, is not only a deep property of heroism, but is also something that explains why they do heroic acts. That is, the deep motivational structure of the heroic person, of the courageous person, explains why it is that they perform the heroic acts that we find easily observable. But when you get down to sages, my problem is in distinguishing between the superficial properties of sages or wise persons that we use just to find them, just to find the right class for investigation, distinguishing that from the deeper properties of wisdom or sagehood that we find most interesting and which we think are essential to sagehood, or essential to being a sage. Next slide, slide 10. So what I suggest in studying wisdom by studying wise persons is that we start with some exemplars of wisdom, and there are some. Some are long dead. Some are, like Father Zosima and Brothers Karamazov, are fictional. We can still discover many things about these exemplars through narrative, but I think we need a larger set of wise people to examine, particularly if we want to interview them or if we want to put them in a laboratory. So I suggest that we need to identify some easily observable features of the exemplars that we can then use to fix the set that we want for investigation. And then we want to examine those people, the exemplars and the people that we have determined are wise, in order to determine what it is about them, the deeper features about them that we think are constitutive of their wisdom. Let me skip slide 11 and go to the last slide, slide 12. So here's just some hypotheses that I want you to consider, and I really want your reaction to these. Properties ascribed to the wise. Are the first five in red, I hope? They should be in red. What I'm suggesting for the ones at the top, the ones in red, is that these might be in the class of easily observable features that we can use to identify the class of wise people, but they're not actually constituents of wisdom. But they're just indicators of wisdom. So the fact that they appear to have emotional equanimity, people go to them for advice, their judgments are later confirmed or endorsed by others. Maybe they have a certain observable demeanor. I don't know if wise people these days have an observable demeanor like Confucius, but that, if there is such a thing, that would make them easy to identify. Maybe they say things that are inspiring. All of these things would be ways to identify them, but we would not think that these features are actually essential to their wisdom. What I'm particularly interested in is what is essential to their wisdom. And I have a bunch of properties or features at the bottom. I'm not sure exactly what to say about them. First of all, I don't know whether these features, the features in black, are features of wise persons. And if so, I don't know whether they're constituents of wisdom or just indicators like the ones at the top. But what I'm looking for are deep features of wisdom that should not only tell us what wisdom is, like H2O tells us what water is, but they should explain the presence of the superficial features, the way being H2O explains the fact that water is a colorless, tasteless liquid. So it should turn out that there's some features, like, say, the last one, can integrate multiple considerations into a single course of action. If that is a constituent of wisdom, that should be something that's not only essential to being wise, but actually explain why it is that people go to them for advice, and their advice is later endorsed, or something like that. So that, in short, is my puzzle. That's my problem. And I thank you for listening, and I am really interested to get your responses. Thank you so much.
Brendan.
Hello?
We're passing the microphone to Boris Kesar.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I wanted to ask, answer your question with a question.
Okay.
I was wondering if it might be more productive to look at your natural kind instead of the type of person, to look at the type of act. Not just for wisdom, but also for saints. Saints, as far as I'm concerned, it's a fictional category. So it might be much easier to do the kind of analysis that you're thinking about that I've never done, to wise acts or saintly acts and so on than to wise people. Because people are complicated, and wise people don't always behave wisely, but a wise act is a wise act.
Okay, so you think there are wise acts that we can identify as wise acts fairly easily, the way we can say we can identify heroic acts.
Yes.
Okay, and so you think that all three of these categories of exemplars can be identified by the performance of certain kinds of acts?
I think it'll be simpler, and it'll avoid the type of problems that you have with properties such as people go to them for advice. People go to many people for advice that I wouldn't suggest they would.
Okay. Well, let me make sure. See, if we can identify wise people by the performance of wise acts, it's easy to identify as wise acts, the way heroic acts are easy to identify, then that would make my life easier. I agree. My problem is that I was thinking that the wisdom of an act is not as easy to identify as the courage of an act. I mean, that is, a courageous act often has its courage sort of written on its sleeve. I mean, it's obvious. But can you say a little bit more about how is it that the wisdom of an act is easy to identify?
I have no idea, but I bet you what I'm arguing is that it is easier to identify the wisdom of an act than a wise person. That's the advantage, maybe.
It's easier to identify the wisdom of the act than the wisdom of the person.
Wait 1 second, Linda. Let Brendan bring you the microphone so Linda can hear. Yes, another Linda.
Oh, okay.
So might we ask the question and have people just reflect, what is the wisest thing you've ever done? As a way of discovering our own wisdom might be an interesting way of understanding it. So what is a wise act? Well, if I ask you and give you moments to reflect, what is the wisest thing you believe you've ever done? What happens? What's your process? What happens?
I'm not sure what you're suggesting I would do with that suggestion. That might be a good way to identify wise acts. That is, we each would be able to identify one ourselves. But would that procedure allow us to identify a class of people or a class of acts that we would then be able to investigate in order to come up with some account of what wisdom is? I mean, and there needs to be a class that we can agree on in order to investigate. That's what I'm suggesting.
Steve.
Hi. I wanted to make perhaps I hate to be a naysayer, but I have a more challenging point, I suppose, is the way to put it. By the way, I'm shocked by how well this technology is working. It's working really well.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. So first of all, I would generalize the class of things that we want to consider both moral and wise from just acts to also events, right? There can be good and bad events. And in fact, that's part of the problem, I think, with trying to think about morality or wisdom as associated with an individual. I mean, individuals behave in different ways. Sometimes we're wise and sometimes we're not wise.
Right.
But in general, exemplar theories assume a similarity space, right? So something, you have your exemplar and something new belongs to the class if it's sufficiently similar. And I wonder, I'm a little concerned that such similarity spaces don't exist in the domain of acts or the domain of events, for that matter, right? So certain things are bad. It's bad for me to push someone off a footbridge. It's also bad for me to shoot them with a gun so they fall off the footbridge. It's also bad for me to tickle them until they fall off the footbridge, right? And yet, well, okay, so maybe they're all good acts, but that's sort of my point, right? The issue there isn't how similar the act or the event is to something, to some prototype. The issue is this a good or bad act for completely other reasons? You sort of need a moral theory or a theory of wisdom to even begin the process of applying your metric, I think.
Okay, a couple things. I actually agree with you about the wide variety of features of wise acts and wise events. It seems to me that wise acts are the products of the processes of the people who perform them. And that if we want to understand wisdom, we should be looking at the features of the people who perform the act as a way of understanding not just what wisdom is in the abstract, but how to go about being wise. So I do think that my view is that it's easier to identify superbly wise people in advance of having an account of wisdom and in advance of having an account of what the common features of wise acts are, because it may turn out that there aren't easily identifiable common features of the acts, even though there are properties of exceptionally wise persons that produce those acts that we could identify, but only with careful investigation. So the point of using the parallel with natural kind is that I think that we can actually identify in a vague sort of way the class that we want to investigate. And so we need some indicators of what that class is. But we need to do that, and we can do that before we actually investigate to find out what it is about either the person or the act that elicits our admiration. So the upshot is, I think, we often can admire someone or some act without understanding what it actually is about them that we admire. And to find out what it actually is about them that we admire, we have to investigate them very carefully. And that is one of the purposes of narratives, and I take it that that's one of the purposes of empirical studies of them.
Stephen Collins?
Sure. I want to raise the issue of the connection between an exemplar and the notion of admirability. In the Buddhist case, for example, there's a lot of discussion as to whether their saints and heroes, bodhisattvas, Buddhas, are to be imitated or indeed can be imitated.
Right.
All we can do is admire them. The Stoics, as you know, often said sages don't exist. They're just so. I wanted to ask you to say some more about why you're using the word exemplar where there are some cases where they're not exemplars.
Okay, and you mean they're admirable, but they cannot be emulated? Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yes. Okay, good. Yes, well, I have a lot of things to say about that. I do think that admirability does not necessarily mean that the person can be emulated. But I do think that there is at least a very interesting subset of admirable persons whom we take to be a sort of ideal selves or a model for ourselves. And what I think is particularly interesting for moral theory and education is that particular set, that is, persons whose admirability is such that we see in them a kind of model or ideal for ourselves. That still doesn't mean we can actually emulate them, because there are plenty of practical conditions that have to be satisfied before you can actually imitate the person. But what I do think that there's something about admiration itself that has a kind of imitating impulse in it. Whether that impulse can be acted upon depends upon a lot of other factors that we would need to discuss. But I thank you for that, because I think that that's a really, I think that's an important distinction.
Thank you, Linda. We're out of time now.
Okay.
But, appreciate very much your willingness to.
And I really appreciate you for doing this.
And we